Welcome to Tourism Talk. I'm your host, Mary Hammond, Director of the Paducah Convention and Visitors Bureau. And my guest today is John Weaver from the board of the Lloyd Tilghman House and Civil War Museum.
Yes.
A little bit of a name change as we enter a new phase of the museum.
Absolutely.
But we'll kind of work our way to that. How about that?
Okay.
I think so many times people, when you say Tillman around Paducah, in this area, they say, oh, the Tillman School. But a lot of people don't know the connection between here, or they know that Tillman, there's a statue of General Tillman, but they don't really know how he came to be in Paducah and what was his background. And I thought maybe we might share some of that story.
Okay.
You tell
All
a
right.
good story.
All right. Lloyd Tilghman, actually his family was from Maryland, and they were a well-connected family. As a matter of fact, his grandfather was on General Washington's military staff during the Revolutionary War, so they were a very well-connected family. And Lloyd Tilghman attended West Point and graduated from West Point in 1836 and went into the Army and was there for a short time and resigned his commission and went into civil engineering, and then went back in the military when the war with Mexico broke out, and was in Mexico during the war there, and then left the Army again and went back to his first love, which was civil engineering.
Now, let's back up a little bit here. West Point, I don't know today, but they always produced civil engineers, the Corps of Engineers.
Yes.
They were always the top of the class at West Point.
Yes.
So there's a little tradition there. And then he also went to school with all the big players through the war with Mexico, where they all learned the strategy.
Learned their craft.
Yeah, yeah, they did. They may have had the book learning at
That's
West Point,
right.
but they yes, honed their skills down in Mexico.
Absolutely, yes. They, of course, there were two primary generals that were in Mexico, and Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor. Of course, Zachary Taylor later became President of the United States, and other figures, Robert E. Lee, U.S. Grant was there. Some very notable figures were there, and Tillman associated with all these people. And so after that war, when he went back into engineering again, he plied his trade primarily with the new technology that was coming on the scene, which was the railroads. And he was very fortunate that he was able to become part of a project building a railroad across the Isthmus of Panama, which was obviously before they built the Panama Canal. First they put a railroad across, and he was one of the chief engineers that was involved in building the railroad. That established a national reputation for Lloyd Tilghman as a civil engineer. Well, it just so happened, timing is everything, that the citizens of Paducah, which had been obviously a river town for quite some time, but they also wanted a railroad to terminate here in Paducah. And so the city fathers at that point in time began to look around for an engineer, and Lloyd Tilghman's name came up to them. They approached Tillman and said, if you will come to Paducah, we'll build you a house and you can bring your family here and live in Paducah. And they built the house. It's the Lloyd Tilghman House, which we know to be on 7th in Kentucky. And Lloyd Tilghman, his wife Augusta, and their 8 children.
8 children?
8
I didn't
children
realize that. Gosh.
came to Paducah and moved into the house that's still there at 7th in Kentucky.
So actually the early economic development efforts brought Tillman here. He didn't come here with a company.
No.
He came here on his own to try and then on the city's behalf find a company that would bring a railroad through Paducah. That's a very forward-thinking city leaders.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course this was something that would really make a large difference in the economy and the growth of Paducah and western Kentucky. And this was really a remarkable effort that took place. And of course the house on 7th Kentucky was one of the incentives that the people of Paducah used to help bring he and his family here.
And actually at that time, town, that was just right probably on the edges of what would be our the downtown, and then Lower Town was just beginning to be developed. And do we know who built that house? Was it?
Actually, the people that were involved in building it, the only ones that we really know about for sure was a family named Woolfolk.
Yes.
And of course, then after Tillman left, they moved into the house when he left. And the house then was not Kentucky. It was what used to be Court Street, and it was the street that the court was on, closer into town. And at one time, the railroad actually ran on Court Street right down to the river. And some of the citizens that lived downtown didn't like the noisy, dirty train coming into the city, so then they moved it farther outside of town.
Sure. Well, and so he stayed here for several years, making this happen.
And they came in 1852.
And then they start having the problems between the states.
Yes.
Kentucky decided not to secede.
There was some great difficulty with that in the state of Kentucky as it was in Missouri. Western Kentucky was, in this case meaning the purchase area primarily, was very southern in their sympathies. And when Kentucky didn't vote to go out, there was a gathering that took place in Mayfield where the citizens of Western Kentucky got together to consider seceding from Kentucky to go with Tennessee, and it failed by one vote.
Oh no, how different our world would be.
Yes, indeed.
We would truly be Tuckasee or
yes, something like that. That's true. But anyway, Kentucky had ties both north and south since they were the buffer between both sections. The governor of Kentucky, Beriah Magoffin, was Southern sympathies, but most of the legislature wanted neutrality. They didn't want either the North to come through or the South, and Kentucky actually voted and ended up with a resolution to declare themselves neutral. If you can imagine such, you can't imagine such a thing today, but they declared themselves neutral between the North and the South, and neither army was supposed to occupy any Kentucky soil. But that didn't last very long.
Right.
In July, some of the northern troops moved into central Kentucky, and a fellow by the name of Leonidas Polk moved into Columbus, Kentucky, and this took place in September. And of course then everybody began choosing up sides. And Lloyd Tilghman was one of the folks that had to choose up sides. He had been involved in the Kentucky militia in 1860, 61, 62. Kentucky probably had one of the premier militia groups in the United States at that time. And he was a colonel in it. And Simon Buckner, who later became governor of Kentucky, was the adjutant general. And Benjamin Hardin Helm was a colonel also in the militia who was Lincoln's brother-in-law. Their wives were sisters.
There's literally brother against brother sort of thing
absolutely,
throughout
absolutely.
our state.
So as they made up their minds what they were going to do, Tillman and Helms, by the way, both decided to go south. And when they did, Tillman and his family moved out of the house at 7th in Kentucky and moved to Clarksville, Tennessee. And Tillman left with lots of sons of Paducah who were in the militia, left with him and ended up at a place called Camp Boone north of Clarksville, where they began to form military units and regiments, and the Kentucky troops gathered there, and that's why they call it Camp Boone.
Now, is this the third?
Yes, from Western Kentucky there were really 3 infantry regiments that were decidedly from Western Kentucky, and a cavalry unit. The 3rd, the 7th, and the 8th Kentucky infantry regiments came from Western Kentucky, as did the 12th Kentucky Cavalry. But the 3rd Kentucky was primarily from McCracken County. And as a matter of fact, Company D in that regiment was known as the Paducah Company. And Tillman was their first colonel, and their lieutenant colonel was a fellow by the name of A.P. Thompson, who had been the Commonwealth attorney for Paducah, and was a couple of years later would come back.
We'll get to that story.
Yes.
So they went down to Clarksville, and they were active in the war?
Oh yes, they became what was the part of the Army of the Mississippi, which later became Army of the Tennessee, which was the primary Western Confederate Army. And they fought at Shiloh, they fought at Vicksburg, they fought at Baton Rouge, and then in 1864 they were mounted and became part of Forrest troops, which
Nathan
were
Bedford Forrest, right?
Yes, Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Right.
That's exactly right.
So while they were away,
Yes.
you've got the people here in town.
Yes.
The men, not as many men, because I'm sure many joined the Union Army as well.
Yes.
So you mostly have people who couldn't serve and families.
That's right.
And then enter U.S. Grant.
Yes, there were, in 1861, there were probably, as best we can tell, about 3,000 residents that were still in Paducah after all the young men left to go to the armies. And I mentioned Leonidas Polk coming into Columbus on the 4th of September. On the 6th of September, there was an unknown fellow that was commanding at Cairo. And he decided, his boss was John C. Fremont, by the way, who was in St. Louis, decided he was going to be a little more aggressive, and he felt like Paducah should be seized for the North because of its importance being at the confluence of the Tennessee and the Cumberland and the Ohio rivers. So he sent a telegram to his boss, John C. Fremont, saying, if I don't hear back from you, I'm going to move on Paducah. Of course, when he sent the telegram, he was already on the boats with 2 regiments of infantry and a battery with steam up, ready to go. And when they sent the telegram, he moved out.
He moved out, right. Well, he was pretty strong-minded, I'd
Yes,
say.
he was. Yes, he was. So he came to Paducah and arrived on the 6th of September with the 9th and the 12th Illinois infantry regiments and Smith's battery of artillery. And when he did, he came to the foot of Broadway with one of the regiments. The other regiment was put ashore about where the convention center is now. And they came around and surrounded Paducah on the landward side, while Grant with the other regiment came in at the foot of Broadway, landed, called for the mayor to come to meet him. The mayor went down, had to get onto a gunboat, because Grant was on the gunboat, had to crawl through the aperture where the gun was to get inside.
These were the gunboats that looked like turtles?
Yes, yes, these were called
turtle
tin-clads. They were converted steamers, riverboats. And anyway, Grant then occupied Paducah, gave his famous proclamation at the foot of Broadway.
Here to protect you from the rebels.
Yes, yes, they did, and at the same time confiscate the funds in the bank.
Now we get down to what he really wanted here.
Actually, Grant was pretty honorable. The problem is that he left a fellow behind named General Eleazar Payne, who wasn't quite as honorable as General Grant was. But nevertheless, they occupied Paducah and said, we'll stay here till we can see you honor the United States, at which point we'll leave. And
wasn't going to happen.
one or both sides of the agreement were never met because they were here occupying Paducah for the duration of the war, and actually built a fort, an earthen fort, west of Paducah, where the old Lourdes or Riverside Hospital used to be. And they also built what were called redoubts, 3-sided earthen forts around on the different roads that came into Paducah to protect those.
There are remnants of those still out there, aren't they?
Yes.
And sometimes
yes,
you
are.
might think that it's just a ditch, and actually it wasn't. It was part of the ditch would be where the men would be, were and the guns on the banks.
Actually, there's one that's, of course, it's deteriorated over the years, but over behind the old Jatan High School, there's one left over there, and the rest of them, of course, are have been graded down when they widen the roads and that kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons why we built one out at Noble Park, which people can see. That's very similar to the ones that were around Paducah.
The one that am familiar with is in Smithland, and it's up at the end of the cemetery on the hill. And I can imagine that if the trees were down, you would be able to see the confluence of the
Absolutely.
with the Cumberland coming into the
Yes,
Ohio.
yes.
And it's still in pretty good shape, but there is, I think, a high school on the other side, and it looks
That's
like
right.
the kids go up there, so it probably
Yes.
isn't long for this world, but
Yeah.
it just looks like paths and earth.
Yeah, what they would do would they would cut down trees and lay them, pile them up in a line, and then they would dig a ditch, and the dirt from the ditch would go on top of the trees, and then the guns would be put behind the embankment, and the ditch would be there to deter people from storming the forts, is what they'd do.
So things were pretty quiet here in Paducah after things, people became a little more accepting of what was happening, that a fort was being built down around the old federal hospital. And I think there were a series of those along the inland rivers. And I was reading not too long ago in the Courier-Journal that that's really the only federal hospital left up there, and there are efforts to save it and restore the property.
Things were fairly quiet, except there was a lot of home guard activity, those kinds of things. And the war moved on past Paducah, moved down to Dover, Tennessee, Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, where Grant gained his reputation as unconditional surrender Grant, where Buckner, by the way, the fellow I mentioned earlier, surrendered Fort Donelson to him.
Where wasn't he Tillman taken hostage down in that area?
Fort Henry, which is near Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River.
So there are twin forts almost.
Yes.
One on each river, one on the Tennessee and one on the Cumberland.
That's right.
And were they earthen forts, or were they?
Yes, they were the
as well?
same kind of forts. And Tillman, by this time, had been promoted to brigadier general, and he was actually in command of the Fort Henry and the Fort Donelson forts, on the Fort Henry being on Tennessee and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. And it was about this time that Grant made his push from Paducah, from Cairo and Paducah actually, up those rivers, first to Fort Henry. There was a battle that was fought between the fort and the ironclad boats that were built not far from here over at Mound City. And unfortunately, the fellow that picked out the site for Fort Henry didn't do a very good job, and it was so low that it was being flooded. By the river already.
So here's the gunboats were like almost right to the fort.
Could fire right into the fort. Could fire right into the fort.
Well, it looked good when the water was low.
Yeah, indeed
Oh
it did.
gosh, so he was captured.
He was captured. He sent the other troops away to Fort Donelson and kept about 30 or so people there to man the guns, but the river boats were successful. Commodore Foote was successful and beat the fort into submission, and Tillman surrendered Fort Henry and surrendered himself and became a prisoner and was sent north for the prison camps at that battle.
Did he stay there long, do you know?
He stayed there for about 4 months, and in the fall was exchanged. He was actually exchanged. They would exchange person for person, rank for rank. So he was a brigadier general. He was exchanged for a brigadier general that was captured from the north, a fellow by the name of John Reynolds, who had been fighting in Virginia and who would later fight at the Battle of Gettysburg and would be killed there.
Well, it amazes me that they swapped them out and let them come free, especially people who made such a difference.
That's right.
So Tillman, at that point, then he went back down to Vicksburg, and where he lost his life.
Yes, he went back to Vicksburg. The first thing he did was he took charge of all the exchanged soldiers, organized those people, and then he took over command of a brigade of infantry. And it wasn't long after that that, again, Grant was coming down the Mississippi and actually got on the eastern side of the Mississippi, came up through Jackson. There's a place between Vicksburg and Jackson called Champions Hill. And so Tillman was there with his brigade. Grant moved into the area. A battle ensued called the Battle of Champions Hill, and it was during this battle, while Tillman was sighting an artillery piece for a battery, that he was struck by a projectile from a federal battery and struck him in the side, and mortally wounded him, and he stayed alive long enough. His son was his aide, and they called for his son who was away, and he came back, and of course his father, Lloyd Tilghman, died in the son's arms on Champions Hill.
And I believe there's a statue of him there,
Yes,
as
yes.
there is on Fountain Avenue.
Yes, there's the statue of him on Fountain Avenue, and there's one actually in Vicksburg Military Park, which is one of the nicer statues there. It's a Tillman and a horse. He's standing and holding his horse.
Well, we don't have a horse. So then switching over to what was happening here in Paducah then,
Yes.
we get to 1864, and that spring, in fact, happens to be on Good Friday, 1864,
Yes.
is when the Battle of Paducah took place.
That's right. Paducah had become, as I said, the war moved farther south, and Paducah was actually a warehousing and depot area for the Federal Army because of the rivers and the railroads. And at this point in time, General Sherman was in North Georgia, and one of the primary routes, if not the primary route for his supplies, was through Paducah. Supplies would come down the Mississippi and down the Ohio River to Paducah, go up the Tennessee River to a place they built called New Johnsonville, offloaded, put on a railroad, go to Nashville, and then to Chattanooga and into North Georgia. And so another fellow by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest that we mentioned earlier was operating in West Tennessee and West Kentucky, and he was given orders to move into West Kentucky to disrupt this supply route for Sherman, and also to re-equip his soldiers. And it was rumored that there was a large supply of horses in Paducah, and of course Forrest needed those horses. So he was in Mississippi, and he got his orders in March, and they started moving north. And they came up into Tennessee, and then ultimately he moved on Paducah. And the troops that he brought with him were the Kentucky troops, a brigade of Kentucky troops and a brigade of Tennessee troops. And in those Kentucky troops was Albert Thompson, who had been the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He was the brigade commander.
The attorney, right?
Yes. And so and in this brigade was the 3rd, the 7th, the 8th, and the 12th Kentucky troops. And so after 2.5 years, if we focus on the 3rd Kentucky, they were coming back home. And they hadn't been home for 2.5 years. And what resulted was this Battle of Paducah with these young men fighting on their own doorsteps, their own homes, around their own families that were still here. But another interesting thing was going on while they were gone. One is that a federal unit, 16th Kentucky Cavalry, was being formed. But there was another unit that was also being formed, and it was designated first as the 1st Kentucky Heavy Artillery Colored. They were called USCT troops, United States Colored Troops. But these were state troops. But the Adjutant General of the Army of the United States, pretty influential man, his name was Lorenzo Thomas, came to Paducah to inspect this 1st Kentucky Heavy Artillery, and he said, this is a good idea. We need to make these United States troops. And so the 1st Kentucky Heavy Artillery Colored was brought into the United States troops and made the 8th Kentucky, 8th USCT.
Right.
And they were formed here in Paducah and garrisoned Fort Anderson, which was built, which we mentioned earlier also, along with the 122nd Illinois and the 16th Kentucky Cavalry, about 665 men altogether, commanded by Stephen Hicks.
And so they were some former slaves right in there, so, and they would have known some of these folks that came in and were firing down on the fort.
Absolutely.
So even though there wasn't a furious battle with not huge loss of life, there poor Colonel Thompson showing off in front of his family.
Yes.
And there he loses his head,
yes.
literally. Sorry. But yes, he shot right off of his horse.
Yeah, he was mounted on his horse, had his hat off, waving his men forward, and he was on his horse on 6th Street. over close to where Park
Right.
Avenue
Yes.
is now, which
where
used
that
to
historic marker
where
would
the
be.
historic marker is, and Park Avenue used to be called Trimble Street. And as he urged his troops on, he was struck by a cannon projectile, and when it did, it literally exploded and destroyed him instantly. The horse lasted about a minute, raced around the block, and it fell dead. And
Gosh.
so Thompson virtually died about on his own doorstep almost. It was a tragic thing.
It was very tragic. This has been the long way to get us to the story of the Tillman Museum reopening on the anniversary of the Battle of Paducah.
Yes.
Which happened to have been Good Friday, 1864, but
March
it will
the
be March
25th.
25th. So on March 25th, 2006, to hear more about these stories that you've been telling us today, and the players, to learn more about the people involved and the civilians involved, to come to the museum.
Yes.
At 7th and Kentucky Avenue, and the museum will be open all day.
Yes.
And there'll be some folks in their uniforms, in which
That's
you look
right.
mighty handsome, I will say.
Well, thank you.
And to come and hear more. This is Paducah did play a part, and here on our rivers, it was an important location, controlling those flow of goods to the south, and making sure that Sherman had his troops
Absolutely.
well supplied so he could continue his
Sure.
march. So I invite everyone to come March 25th.
Yes.
You will be hearing more about the Lloyd Tilghman House and Civil War Museum as the hours are more regular than they have been in the last couple of
Absolutely.
years.
Yes.
And hear about the Civil War walk that will be during the quilt show.
That's right.
What days will that be?
Wednesday through Saturday during the quilt
26th,
show.
27th, and 28th.
Yes, that's right.
I believe that is, but it's through the quilt show. Do come down, and where will they meet?
What we will do is we will actually meet for the tour at the foot of Broadway
Okay.
by the
Civil
flood
War,
walls.
Civil
Yes.
War mural, that's a perfect place to gather. If you would like more information on this, please check our website, paducahtourism.org, or give us a call. That 1-800-PADUCAH number is so easy to remember, and we'll let you know more details about the hours of the museum as they become established, and about these walking tours.
Absolutely.
And John, you'll probably be right down there giving some of these walking
Yes,
tours.
I will be there.
Will you tell a great story and really bring history alive for us?
Well, thank you.
And we'd like to know some more of those stories. So I hope that you'll join us at the Tillman Museum on March 25th, or down during Quilt Show for the walking tours. So we hope that we'll see you then, and I think we're just about out of time. No more fingers are being held up. So John Weaver, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, and everyone's welcome to come to the Tillman House.
Oh, it'll be good. Thanks.
Thank you.